Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the NJIT Cyberpsychology Seminar Series. My name is Dr. Julie Ansis, and I'm the director of the Cyberpsychology program at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. A bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you could please keep your mic muted, and that allows for less distraction in the online space. Our speaker is going to present for the first 45 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. Please place any questions you may have in the chat with a prefix of Q or the word question, so I'm able to differentiate that from comments. The Cyberpsychology Seminar Series is designed to showcase the many different facets of research and scholarship within the field of cyberpsychology. The series features some of the nation's leading experts at the emerging intersection of psychology and technology. This morning, we're privileged to have Dustyn Leff with us, and the title of his presentation is "You Only Have One Up Here: A Digital Dive into Problematic Gaming." Dustyn Leff is currently a first-year medical student at the University of Minnesota, Duluth Campus. He obtained degrees in biology and psychology as an undergraduate, and then a master's degree in experimental psychology at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. His thesis project examined problematic gaming, looking at both self-reported behaviors and reactions to different stimuli using eye tracking technology. His research has focused on virtual reality and its impact on learning, working in a collaborative group involving members from psychology, communications, and computer science. Dustyn Leff's professional interests include the biological correlates of addiction. And I welcome you, Dustyn, and thank you so much for agreeing to be our second presenter for this cyberpsychology seminar series, and I'm going to hand it over to you now.
All right, well, thank you very much, Julie. So I'm just going to share my screen here so you can see all my background. All right, so as Julie said, my name is Dustyn Leff, currently at the University of Minnesota Duluth Medical School, Duluth Campus. And I want to start off by saying I love video games, and I'm sure a lot of you do too. So I remember kind of getting the Nintendo 64 back in the 90s and not really knowing how to read. And my parents were like, well, to play these games, I guess you're going to have to learn to read better. And that's just what I did. Learn to read so I could play these different games. But what I like to think about now is just how much time that I've actually spent playing video games, and kind of what I could have done with that time throughout my life. I'm not regretting it. I'm not bashing it in any sort of way, but I just think the title of the talk is kind of right on the money there, where you only have one up here: a digital dive into problematic gaming. So this talk is going to be focusing on kind of comparing substance abuse, and then some problematic behaviors. So kind of a little bit about myself. Julie already talked about where I kind of got my degrees from and where I'm currently at. I was also an instructor in the psychology department for 2 years. Some of the classes that I taught were things like cognition, sensation and perception, and then physiological psychology. So all things that I was really interested in, and kind of got to help me get to where I am now in terms of the knowledge and the research for kind of this problematic substance use and problematic behaviors. And over the past 5 years, I've done a bit of research in terms of animal research, alcohol use, smoking cessation, and cannabis use, augmented and virtual reality, and then also, of course, video games, which we'll be talking about today. So there are risks and there are some benefits of video games. The point of the talk isn't that, though, but I just want to kind of address it up front, some of the things that include the risk and the benefits. So some of the risks, Video gaming can be both a cause and a consequence of loneliness. So humans are very social creatures. And being social creatures, we like talking to other people. We like being around other people. And if you're playing video games a lot, you're not really getting that. I mean, you can still like talk to your friends and talk to people online, but you're not getting that kind of that human-human interaction together. One of the things I like to kind of talk about now is COVID. How does COVID play into this and this kind of this loneliness? We were kind of stuck inside for months on end. We weren't really able to go out because we feared for our safety. And we weren't really able to get into those gatherings with friends or even family sometimes. But video games, that was kind of a way around it. Like, what I kind of wonder is what protective factor maybe video games had. So I'm sure you kind of all noticed or heard that the Nintendo Switch was sold out constantly during this. Not just a supply chain issue, but people were kind of buying these systems to play more and more. Games like Animal Crossing, like, oh my gosh, I kind of wonder how much Animal Crossing kind of helped some people's mental health. And I'm going to be really interested in reading some of the research that came out maybe during COVID or kind of slightly after, just to kind of see what exactly happened. Some of the benefits of video games, they're very interactive. They can increase reaction time and hand-eye coordination. So I have a couple of simulators shown here, like the military will use kind of simulations, surgeons will use simulations, and then pilots will use simulations. And the point of simulations is that you can mess up, and there's kind of like no real life consequences. So I know I would feel a lot better if I had a pilot do hundreds of hours behind a flight simulator instead of just his first time doing it in a real cockpit. So these kind of simulations just allow you to mess up and get better and get more experience. And that's kind of the point of them. So I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit more about myself in terms of what I've kind of had and some of the games that I've played. So I've been a gamer, I don't know, I'm 29 now, and that's kind of some of my earliest memories are playing video games with my cousins and my friends. So you can see all the systems I've owned here. This is my gaming laptop that I've had since 2015. With that gaming laptop, here is my Steam history. It's just kind of a platform on your computer that you can play video games on. So this isn't a comprehensive list by any means of all the video games I've played. These are just the ones that I've had the most hours on. And I've had this for 5 years now. What you can see up here is Fallout 4, 126 hours. So I've spent that much time playing that one video game. That's 3 weeks of full-time work. And you might not say that's not a whole lot. It's been 5 years. And I'll let you know that I played this between my undergrad and grad careers. So over the summer, I put 126 hours just into this one video game. Another game here, RimWorld. So RimWorld, I put 58 hours into it. And for those 58 hours, that was all in 1 week. So 1 week, I put 58 hours into that video game. And that kind of just went by in a flash. I don't really even remember playing that long, but I did. You can kind of see it right here. If you were to add all the time up on my Steam history, that would equal 29 full days. So 29 full days of my life I've spent playing video games, just really what you see right here. That isn't including any of these other games that I've probably spent hundreds of hours on, including Pokemon, Elder Scrolls Skyrim, Modern Warfare 2, Battlefield 4, and Overwatch. So kind of keep that in mind, that the more time you spend playing video games, the less time you have for other things, right? So that's kind of like one of the main points of kind of this talk. So kind of the next thing that I'm going to get into is talking more about kind of some statistics, and then we're going to talk about some similarities and differences between substance use and then problematic behaviors. So I'm going to talk about some entertainment software association stats. So the Entertainment Software Association is basically like Nintendo, Microsoft, Sony, and all the game developers are part of this association. And then usually once a year, they come out with some statistics. So 64% of households own a device on average, and then 65% of adults play video games. The average age of a gamer is 32 for males and 34 for females. So you might think like, wow, I thought most people who play video games, or the average age would be a lot lower than that. It would be like high school and college age people. And if you think about it, about how old Mario is, and then you kind of just do the math in your head, it'd be people in their 30s or even 40s, really, that kind of were playing Mario when it first came out. So the average age of the gamer is in their low 30s. The split between males and females also playing is about 50-50. And people, usually if you ask somebody, they think it is more of like male dominated. They maybe think it's more like 70 or 80% male and 20-30% female. But on average, it's about 50-50. The games that they play are different. Usually males tend to play more shooter games or more sports games, and females tend to play more kind of like puzzle games or games like The Sims or things like that. But on average, it's about 50-50. And then even though this is an old statistic, the average gamer spends about 13 hours per week playing video games. So think about that, 13 hours per week. If you multiply that by 4, that's about 52 hours per month that somebody's playing video games, if they are playing video games, the average gamer. So I like to show this too, just to kind of talk about, or just to kind of show you some examples of this problematic behavior, because you might say, what is problematic behavior? Or are people actually having problems? So in 2002, a woman sued Nintendo because her son died after suffering seizures caused by playing Nintendo 64 for 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. You might say to yourself, well, that could be just because of the screen flashing and everything like that. And I would agree with you. It could be because of that. New Mexico, 2006. Woman convicted of second-degree murder and child abandonment for allowing her 3.5-year-old daughter to die of malnutrition and dehydration while playing World of Warcraft. Florida, 2010. Woman pled guilty to second-degree murder for shaking her baby to death. She told investigators that the baby's crying had interrupted her while playing Farmville. So Farmville, some of you remember, was that old Facebook game. So it just kind of shows that this kind of gross negligence happened because individuals were playing video games and neglecting kind of their like real life like responsibilities. And then there's other stories like this too. And then the one I just want to point out of this is that in Florida, 2018, 2 video gamers killed by rival at Madden tournament. So video games usually get a bad rap for kind of inciting violence or making people more violent. And the point of this talk isn't to talk about that whatsoever. It's just kind of just to show you this one example. But you can definitely look at the research behind it. And I think you'll be kind of surprised by the research. So kind of getting into it, next we'll talk about the prevalence estimates. So prevalence, kind of how many individuals are really affected by this. And kind of the research that I've seen is between 0.1 and about 10%. And you might say that's such a wide range. Like, why is it so wide? That's just because the way we look at it, or the way we kind of record it, or kind of the different countries involved, we all kind of use different measures. And we call it different things, which we'll talk about, I think, in the next slide. So the number I want you to keep in mind is just about 0.1 to 10%. So a little bit about the history of. In 1996, internet addiction, the emergence of a new clinical disorder. So Dr. Kimberly Young thought, like, hey, this internet thing can be problematic to individuals. Like, I think we should include this to be like an addictive behavior. In 2011, the American Society of Addiction Medicine added behaviors to kind of the list of things that can be addictive. So no longer substances, or not just substances anymore, it can also be behaviors now. So you could think about things like problematic gambling. In 2013, internet gaming disorder was added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, Section 3, so the DSM-5. So this is basically what clinicians use to diagnose different disorders. In 2018-2019, gaming disorder is defined in the 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases. So this is the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization now is taking a look at kind of this problematic gaming. And kind of the problem with research now and all these different kind of like large bodies, they're calling it different things. So you could see in 2013, it's called internet gaming disorder. The World Health Organization is calling it gaming disorder. So does it have to be online to be counted as problematic gaming? That's kind of where the research is now. So it's also been called things like video game addiction, gaming disorder, internet gaming disorder, and all these different other titles for it. So you can see where it can kind of get confusing. So the next, I'm going to talk about some criteria for internet gaming disorder. And remember, this was from the DSM-5. A thing to keep in note that I'll kind of talk about again is that you have to meet 5 of the 9 criteria for diagnosis, and it has to result in significant impairment to your life. So I'm just going to kind of read through these quick. So tolerance, withdrawal, persistence, displacement, problems, preoccupation, escape, deception, and then conflict. So you can see all 9 of these different criteria. So let's take tolerance. Amount of time to feel desired effects increases. Now let's just replace a couple words with that now. Amount of substance used to feel desired effects increases. And you can kind of do that with all of these criteria. Then you might think to yourself like, oh, this seems very similar to kind of the substance use criteria. And I would totally agree with you. This is kind of where it was taken from. So you can just see that kind of what they're using to try to identify this internet gaming disorder is by using substance abuse criteria. And just remember to keep in mind, you have to meet 5 of the 9 criteria for diagnosis, and it has to result in significant impairment to your life. So next we'll kind of get into some of the biology stuff, some of my favorite stuff. And we'll start off with substance use, and then we'll kind of get into the similarities and differences. So the neural mechanisms of substance use. This will be pretty basic. We're not going to go too in depth with it, but just kind of surface level. So addictive substances trigger the release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. So basically, dopamine is that neurotransmitter that either wants to, like, makes you feel good, or it makes you want to do that behavior again. And then there's some neural changes that begin in the ventral tegmental area, or the VTA, which we can see right here. And then they strengthen the excitatory synapse on dopamine neurons. So we have the ventral tegmental area, we have kind of these projections, and then it'll synapse in these different areas of the brain. And the ones that we're just going to focus on today is pretty much just the nucleus accumbens. There's other areas like the hippocampus, and the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex, but that's kind of, I think, a little bit too much for this talk. So we'll kind of talk about the role of the striatum and how kind of these habits go from, or how these behaviors go from pleasurable to kind of habit forming. So we talked about the ventral striatum, which is kind of where this nucleus accumbens is. So the nucleus accumbens, kind of that reward center of the brain. We have the dorsal striatum, which is involved in operant conditioning. So as kind of psych students, I'm sure you'll learn about operant conditioning at some point, but just kind of briefly, I'll just talk about it here. So think about a rat in a cage, and every time it presses a lever, it gets a treat. So you think, like, oh, every time I press this lever, I'm going to get a treat. So I'm going to press this lever more, right? Easy enough. What about if I press the lever and it shocks me? I'm probably not going to press that lever anymore, right? So kind of think about this with any kind of behavior or any kind of substance abuse where pleasurable effects reinforce behaviors to receive the drug. So I liked the drug the first time I took it, so I'm going to take it again. Versus that drug made me feel terrible. I never want to have it again. And over time, these behaviors can become habitual. And then kind of where I was alluding to before, that the consequences of our action, either getting a treat or getting a shot, teach us to repeat the behavior or not. So kind of easy enough, very surface level stuff, I think, but just to kind of talk about it. So what are some similarities between substance abuse and then these problematic behaviors like gaming? Well, behavior changes. Over time, if you're really into a video game, you might try to push other things out of your life to do that behavior, which is playing video games, right? Well, you can think about in terms of substance abuse too. If you're taking a substance, over time you're going to want to take more and more and more of it. So you're going to kind of push other things out of your life. And this can affect all these other things like sleep, which we'll talk about next too. This can affect your impulse control. So also kind of a behavioral change. But I just kind of wanted to point out this liking to craving. So think of an individual that uses heroin. So initially they might really, really like it, right? But over time, they might not like it so much, but their body just really craves it because if they don't take it, they're going to feel terrible, right? And this can kind of lead to kind of this spiral or this loss of control. Tolerance, kind of where you have to take more and more of the substance or do more and more of the behavior to kind of make yourself feel good. And then neurological mechanisms. So there's that similarities with that dopamine release, so that dopamine neurotransmitter. So video gaming and gambling both cause, if it's enjoyable, it causes an increase in dopamine release. Alcohol and drugs also do the same thing. So here's some similarities, just very basic, not even close to a comprehensive list, but just some very basic similarities. But what are some differences? Substances cross the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is basically like, you could think of it as kind of a protective factor. So the stuff in your body doesn't go directly into your brain because we don't really want that. We want some protective factor for your brain, right? Well, substances are really, really good at crossing that blood-brain barrier. Video games don't really do that. It'd be really hard to jam a Nintendo 64 into your brain, right? Video games aren't illegal. Usually drugs of abuse are, because drugs of abuse have this kind of schedule system that can affect the research behind it and everything like that. But video games don't. Video games do have a rating system though, but it really only goes to when you're an adult. And once you're an adult, you don't have to worry about this rating system anymore unless you have children. And then there's also different physiological mechanisms. So for example, we have a drug here, cocaine. Cocaine can block the reuptake of dopamine. So basically dopamine going back to where it was released from. So now we have all this dopamine floating around on the synapse here. So the synapse kind of is kind of on the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. And you'll probably learn about this as well. But with all this dopamine floating around, that's all that dopamine can cause these excitatory signals and increase the intensity of the effect. So basically what cocaine does is it makes the effect just that much stronger of dopamine. Video games don't do that. There's no substance involved. So kind of moving on. So how are video games really addicting? Well, kind of what I talked to at first, that social connection. I remember back in my day when when I had a Game Boy, that you had to use these little link cables and be within like 2 feet of somebody that you wanted to trade with or battle with on Pokemon. You don't really have to do that anymore. You can play with people across the world at literally any time of day now. Immersion. You can basically make your own character, personify yourself to be who you want to be, that, or to show other people who you want to be. So for example, back when I was in high school, playing an online game, this was my character. This was kind of how I saw myself in the digital game. Replay value. Games like World of Warcraft and Call of Duty, they don't have endings. There's no princess in a castle that once you save, the game ends, right? World of Warcraft, Call of Duty, you can just continuously play over and over again. It kind of never runs out of stuff to do. Rewards are variable ratio, and we'll talk about this on the next slide. Persistence, or fear of missing out. So when you're not playing video games, other people are playing. So if you think about it, other people are getting ahead. Other people are getting more experience, more levels, better gear, and you're not, because you are not playing. So you kind of have this fear of missing out because everybody else is getting ahead, but you're not. Loot boxes, which I liken to gambling, upgrades and expansions. So let's say you play through a video game and you beat it, and then you get kind of bored of it. Well, maybe the developers come out with some new expansion for it, some new levels for it. And you like the game so much, you want to play this kind of new expansion. So maybe you start a new character and you play through the game again until you get to that expansion. And with that expansion, you also have to pay more money, and usually that's anywhere between $10 and $20. So on top of the $60 game you already paid for, you're at about $80 now. Real life rewards of publicity. So what you see down in this picture is a League of Legends tournament, and you can see that it's in a stadium, and this stadium is sold out. So I think in the future that esports, or these electronic sports, are just going to kind of take off even more than what they are now. So you can see that with like Amazon kind of having Twitch now, and they're really promoting these different kind of tournaments, especially when all other sports have basically been canceled because of COVID. Kind of watching people play video games like on YouTube or Twitch has really exploded. Investment, so you've put all this time, effort, and money into video games, and all you kind of have to show for it is your save file. So if I played a video game for 124 hours, Fallout 4, and I have this save file, I'm probably never going to delete it, even though I'm probably never going to play the game again, just because of all the time and effort that I've actually put into it. Like, nobody wants to kind of delete something that they've put time and effort into. Pay to play. So most console systems now require an upfront cost. So this could be like PlayStation Plus, Xbox, I think it's Gold or whatever it is, and then the Nintendo membership as well, for you to even start playing games online. The randomness, so many levels now are procedurally generated. So they kind of are different each time you play, or some random things happen. Or when you play a video game online, the number of people kind of changes constantly, so you never have to play with the same person twice. Familiarity, or the nostalgia factor, I like to call it. So by slapping Mario or Star Wars on a video game, you're kind of bringing in that entire fan base because they're already familiar with the characters and they have some familiarity with the background. So it's kind of an easy way for game developers to just kind of get people to buy their game. And then, of course, sense of control. So sense of control you might not have in your real life, but by playing games like The Sims or Star Wars, you directly control what is going on. So maybe that kind of alleviates some of that anxiety that you have because you don't have control over your life. So we'll kind of talk about that operant conditioning and the variable ratio next. So the operant conditioning, think of that mouse again. If it presses the lever, it's going to get a treat. But if I cause a shock to happen, it's not going to press that lever anymore, right? Well, now we're going to talk about variable ratio and gambling. So with gambling, let's say you're playing the slots, right? You know that if you sit there long enough, that you'll win, right? If you sit there long enough and you play long enough, you'll win. You don't know how long it's going to be until you win, or how many times you have to play until you win, right? Because that would be too easy to kind of figure out. And casinos kind of operate on like they win more than you win, right? So think about kind of the slot machine example, that if you keep playing, eventually you're going to win, but you don't really, or I should say, once you do win, you feel really good, right? Well, you don't really think about how much money you initially put in to win whatever you want. And kind of over time, it might, if you were to add it all up, you would realize that you probably lost more than you actually won. So now let's talk about video gaming. So I like to use this compulsion loop example. So let's say I start a video game off. I can't usually go to the final boss right away and beat it because my character is very weak and I don't have the gear or the levels or the skills to do it, right? Well, you kind of have to start off with some lower level monsters. So in this example, let's say I defeat a monster. I get some gear, some random drops, some gold, some experience, and then I level up my character. Okay, my character's level up. I still can't beat the final boss, but I can beat the next enemy. I beat the next enemy, I get some gold, gear, and experience. Now I can face the next enemy. And you can just see how this kind of builds up on each other. And this is just a really easy way for game developers to kind of program their games to make you continuously play them and be continuously rewarded here. And you don't know what you're going to get, maybe, or what kind of rewards you're going to get, but you know you are going to get replaying. So what are some consequences? Well, video gaming, it can really affect your sleep and fatigue. So with sleep and fatigue, basically, okay, make sure the connection comes back. So with sleep and fatigue, basically you're pushing off sleep. Because let's say you're playing video games and you're playing late into the night, you just kind of say one more game and then you just push off everything else. You can also get some repetitive strain injuries or physical pains. Texter's thumb, think about that. Or eye strain. So I know I use kind of blue light glasses or blue light blocking glasses now because I'm on the screen pretty much the entire day now with school and research stuff. School performance. I know when Skyrim came out, my school performance dropped dramatically because I was spending all my time playing and not studying. Memory can also impact. Self-esteem. Impulse control. We can all think of the example of just one more chip or just one more piece of candy, and oftentimes it doesn't really turn out to be like that, right? But you can also kind of show that in video gaming. Just one more match, just one more round of Fall Guys, just one more round of Fortnite. But does it ever really just turn out to be one more round or like 2, 3, or 4? Self-care can always, because you're spending all this other time playing video games, you're not exercising maybe or eating healthy or things like that. And then this kind of newer thing called game transfer phenomena, also used to be called, I think, the Tetris effect. But basically, you see health bars appear. So basically, what you're seeing is what you saw in the video games is projecting on to kind of real life. The Tetris effect would be when people play so much Tetris that the world just kind of like goes into those blocky sections and you try to like fit pieces of the world together. So I might think about like, okay, Dustyn, that's cool and whatnot. Yeah, video games can be good, video games can be bad, but is there really a point to it? And I'll be like, yes, like who cares? Well, we have some treatment programs nowadays. Well, there's one called Game Quitters, which is kind of like an online thing that can get you in touch with maybe a clinical counselor. There's also Restart, which is a program on the West Coast that is inpatient that will try to help you detechnify, you heard me right, detechnify your life. Bill Nye, on his new Netflix show, Bill Nye Saves the World, he talks about video games, and he brings on some researchers and then also some streamers to talk about video gaming and kind of how it's really changed and where it's going. Governments, places like China and South Korea, they've tried to enact like shutdown laws where the internet will just kind of like stop working for gaming. These were, I believe, all repealed. I think they were kind of in the early 2010, 2015. So they've all been repealed, but just kind of showing the extent that governments are trying to go to kind of limit people playing video games. And parents will often wonder, like, is my child playing too much? Like, how much is a good amount for them to play? Or health, like, my child is playing video games all day. They're not exercising and playing with other kids and being a kid. Like, kind of how I grew up and how they're growing up now is completely different. And then also the age. Like, is the content my child is accessing, is that appropriate for their age group? Well, this has kind of gotten a lot trickier now, especially when a lot of kids are getting their entire education through a screen now. They're no longer really in class because of our current health prices, but now they're getting all their content through a screen, and that can be kind of scary. So Jill asked me to talk a little bit about my research. So like she said before, I use eye tracking technology. And what does eye tracking technology do? Well, it can measure both the automatic and controlled movements of the eye. And we can kind of see that right here. You can see an example of what I used for my experiments. So this could measure both the pupil diameter, the dwell time, and then initial fixation. So pupil diameter is kind of like a measure of physiological response. So for example, if you turn the light on, what's going to happen to your pupil? Is it going to get larger or is it going to get smaller? Well, it's going to get smaller, right? Dwell time is how long an individual is looking at a certain point on the screen or on a certain object on the screen. Initial fixation, if I was to show them two images, which one would they look at first? And from here, we can kind of look at attentional bias, and then through demographic surveys, we can kind of correlate these different behaviors. So eye tracking has been used in a lot of other either substance use or behavioral disorders. So alcohol use, sexual stimuli, smoking stimuli, problematic gambling, and then also it's been used in internet gamers. So for example, alcohol use. So if I have somebody that's maybe has been abusing alcohol for most of their life, they score really high on those measures of alcohol abuse, and I was to show them two pictures, maybe one being alcohol and the other one being some neutral image. They're probably going to be looking more at the alcohol image, so they're probably going to have more dwell time to it, and then also initial fixation, so they'll probably look at it first. And this is kind of where like I said before, where my research was for my master's thesis. So the video I'm going to show you next is kind of a 10-second clip, which you can see right here, but it just shows you kind of how accurate eye tracking technology is at looking at the eye. So this is 10 seconds. In this 10 seconds, 650 data points were collected. So every 0.017 seconds, a data point is collected. We usually have participants look at images for a couple minutes. So for each participant, we get about 20,000 data points that we then have to go through. A lot of data points, but also you get a lot of data with it. So that's kind of the bulk of the talk. So I just kind of, this isn't the last slide, but I just kind of want to kind of bring it all together now. So conclusion, time. The more time you spend playing video games, the less time you have to do other things in your life. There's a lot of consequences, including health, memory, family, school, money. We didn't talk really about money, but we are going to talk about it here. So in 2017, about $36 billion were spent on the video game industry. That's a lot of money. And you can just see over time that it's been dramatically increasing. And I imagine that it's going to get, that it's going to get a lot more. Or just kind of looking at what it was this last year, oh my gosh, like I just imagine like it exploding. You might say, well, like, yeah, I'm paying for entertainment. Like that's no different than if I was to pay to go to the movies, right? And I would agree with you. But let's take an example here. So Fortnite, I know it's kind of dated now, but Fortnite, overall, the people who did spend money on Fortnite spent on average $85. You might say, wow, that's a lot of money. I hope they got some good stuff that really helped them play the game better, like some better gear. And if you look at this kind of figure right here, this was all spent on cosmetic items, things that did not help you in the game whatsoever. So you spent $85 on a free game. Playing a lot does not equal problem. It has to result in significant impairment in your life, and you have to meet 5 of those 9 criteria as well. So I'm not bashing video games whatsoever. I know I love video games, but all I'm saying is that just kind of like take stock of how much you actually are playing video games, and is there some other stuff in your life that you really want to do, but you're just spending too much time playing these video games. And then more research is needed. This is kind of where I think a lot of you come in, especially this new cyberpsychology program, that it's very much in its infancy. You could see that in 2011, 2013, 2018, all these big kind of like rulings from the regulatory bodies came down. And this kind of opens up the avenue for a lot of research in terms of kind of where you all come in. And then my last real slide is the future of gaming and where I see gaming going. Well, I see graphics greatly increasing. For example, 1985, Mario was really pixelated, right? 2014, he's looking a lot better. He's no longer pixelated. He doesn't have all these polygons anymore. He's just looking really good. Now let's take a better example, Final Fantasy VII Remake. So 1997, you can see this character very much polygonated. But now you can see basically each individual strand of hair, and the lighting just looks amazing. And I just imagine as the technology, as the hardware, as kind of the graphics cards, as the display monitors get better, the graphics are just going to get that much better too. Also, immersion, interactivity, and identification, I think is also going to increase greatly. So let's think of the Nintendo Wii, right? You had kind of the Wiimote, and it was really awesome because basically what you were doing with your hand and how you're holding the controller affected the gameplay. And that was awesome. That was so much fun. I remember playing it for the first time, and it was great. Now, you can basically put on a couple pound headset and grab some controllers and be inside the video game in virtual reality. So, for example, this individual here is using the Oculus Quest. And you are not connected to anything anymore. You just have free play. As long as you have some space, you are kind of just in that digital world. And playing games like Skyrim, where you're actually like shooting fireballs or swinging a sword, it just makes the game feel like that much better. You're like a part of it now. Another example, Five Nights at Freddy's. I'm sure a lot of you have heard or played it. Five Nights at Freddy's on your computer, it was kind of scary. There was lots of jump scares, and it could be a little frightening. Well, let me tell you that playing it in virtual reality, where the animatronics are 7 feet tall, screaming at you, it's very terrifying. And I would recommend anybody who hasn't tried it, definitely play it. I haven't been able to play it long because I get scared super easily because of it. But in the future, I don't see video games really becoming anything like The Matrix, where you have to be like hooked into your brain. Nothing like that. But I do see a scenario like Ready Player One, like coming out, where you have this headset, you have gaming gloves instead of a controller, and then you can wear like a suit where, let's say if you get shot or if somebody like stabs you in a certain area of the body, that it will vibrate to let you know like, oh, you got hit here. I could see that happening. This kind of like has all been turning on its head lately, kind of just with the rise of technology and how fast it's going. Elon Musk is trying to develop this Neuralink program where putting electrodes into your brain to kind of stimulate things, and it sounds kind of scary to me to see where that technology might be going. It could definitely have some good medicinal benefits, but we just have to kind of see where that technology goes. Black Mirror, which is also on Netflix, it's a Netflix show. I'd recommend it to any of you who are interested in it. But they also came out with some augmented and virtual reality stuff. So augmented is basically you see the physical environment, like the environment that you're in, but stuff is projected on top of it. Virtual reality, you're inside the game basically. So I'm not going to spoil it for you or anything like that, but I'd recommend if you're interested in augmented reality and virtual reality that you just take a look. So I just kind of want to leave you with some resources. Here's the link to Game Quitters. Here's the link to Restart. And here's a couple books that I've been recommended, that I read most of these during kind of quarantine, that if you're interested more on the topic, that you take a look at. You can usually get them off of Amazon or a bookstore pretty cheap. They're not too much. And they're all really good resources, I think. And some of you might say, like, I don't care about any of this. I just want to play video games and ignore my adult problems, and that's totally fine too. And then the last slide, I just want to acknowledge that my research was done in partial fulfillment for my degree, and that the research funding was provided by the University of Minnesota Duluth Department of Psychology. And with that, are there any questions?
All right, thank you so much, Dustyn. That was really enjoyable, and I loved how you brought in your personal experience as a gamer, former gamer. I don't know how you would identify.
Well, we'll wait until winter break, and then I'll be a gamer again.
Okay, all right. You're not recovered. And just the research in psychology and neurobiology to speak to potentially problematic aspects of gaming and implications, right, for our cognitive functioning, for our psychological health, our financial status, and also the future of gaming. That was quite interesting. So thank you. I will look at the chat here, and I see one comment that was earlier, and if you could please put Q in front of your question. This was much earlier in your presentation from Andy Nguyen, who asked, how did you create some questionnaires to ask people to get these stats? What measurement did you make to ensure these data are accurate?
So a lot of the measures that we used for my current research, or I guess my research that I had for my master's, that was the Internet Gaming Disorder Scale by Gentile. I think it's a 2015 scale, but it just modeled it after that criteria. Like you have to meet 5 of these 9 criteria, and it was 20, I think it's 27 questions. So it's about 3 questions for each of those like individual scales, like tolerance, things like that. So like that scale was already kind of well established for that area. What measurement did you make to make sure these data are accurate? So I guess I'm not quite sure on the question, but I know for mine, for the eye tracking, we had individuals, like for the piloting of it, we made sure that they could identify each of the pictures we were showing them. So if there was 2 pictures, be like, can you identify each of the pictures? Or can you look at wherever a gaming image is, or wherever an alcohol image is? So we had individuals like look at each of those and to test that the equipment is working, that the pictures were good, and that the individuals themselves knew what the images were.
Thank you. Ross Bonifacio is asking, what motivated you to research problematic gaming behaviors?
I guess that starts off with my mentor, Dr. Rebecca Gilbertson, also in the psychology department at UMD. Her background was in alcohol disorders. And then I think somebody came up to her and talked to her about that. And then she was like, oh yeah, this seems pretty interesting. And I think this was back in 2014 when I was still an undergrad taking classes from her. She's like, hey, do you want to help with this project? And I was, for sure. So I worked with some of the grad students, and then I was her grad student, and then I was her colleague. So that's kind of what really got me there. And especially with my background, like I love video games. So being able to do research on them was, I think, the coolest thing ever.
Yelda Zemitsar, who's a colleague of mine, asks, can you tell us a little bit about your empirical research questions? You may have just done that, maybe an experiment of yours using eye tracking technology.
Yeah, so our question, well, I guess, yeah, our question was, we used a couple different criteria because I showed you like all those different scales and all the different ways to measure it. But our basic one was if people are playing more video games or they experience like they have like a higher rating on this scale that kind of measures the 9 different criteria. So will these individuals have attentional bias to whatever, video game images? So I guess that was kind of like our overall question. And then we were able to segment it by like binge behaviors, which was 6 or more hours. So the 6 or more hours criteria kind of came from the Restart program, where you're playing 6 or more hours in a given day. So then we were able to use like all these different kind of criteria and kind of get at to see, I guess, like if individuals are having like problems. And even using these different criteria, a lot of our data pointed to like, yes, like the more somebody plays or the higher they score or the more that they binge, the more attentional bias that they'll have towards those images. And that's been shown for things like alcohol abuse, where the higher somebody scores or the more they binge or the more they consume, the more they'll look at those alcohol images.
Okay. I have a question, Dustyn, which is not a new question, but do you have any recommendations for parents and caretakers, things to look for in their children, ways to be more keyed in to sort of what's happening with them alone in their rooms, playing games for hours?
So I'm gonna steal this from Dr. Douglas Gentile, who's at, I think, Iowa State University. I just listened to one of his talks last week, and I've listened to his talks in person. I've met the guy in person. He's very nice. But parents have a strong trickle-down effect. But the thing to keep in mind is they don't really know that they're causing a change because you can't really see both sides of it. Like if you were to do it and if you weren't to do it, you're not able to see that. But parents have such a strong trickle-down effect. And by establishing like boundaries or technological literacy, they can actually like improve kind of the outcomes for their children. And that can be seen by the teachers or other individuals, by friend groups, things like that. But the parent largely probably isn't going to see it. And that's what makes it really, really hard, because parents are always like, how much do I really interfere with my child's screen time? And that's magnified now with how much they're in front of screens. They're getting their entire education in front of it now. And that's just really hard for parents.
Thank you. Nancy Stefan Fleur, I didn't know you were a gamer, Nancy. She says Quest is really good, but are we going to have the holodeck anytime soon? I thought Disney was still working on it.
Not quite sure about that one, but the Quest, they just came out with the second Quest, which they're saying is 11 times more powerful than the original Quest. And I am so very excited to try it out eventually, because I just have my normal Quest, but I want to get the second one because I really like doing that virtual reality gaming.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. from Anas Rashid. Based on your research, do you believe problematic gaming has a bias for online gaming? Or do you believe that it doesn't matter whether it's offline or online? Personally, when I play RPGs or games that lack multiplayer, like The Last of Us, I only play through it once, in contrast to games like COD, where I can spend multiple hours playing.
Yeah, and this is kind of where that, I don't want to say dichotomy, but where that like 2013 diagnostic statistics manual saying like internet gaming disorder, and then the World Health Organization saying gaming disorder, that's just kind of where it comes into play, where like we don't really know how to look at it or how to really study it, because there's so many different criteria being used for it right now. We know something's there, but unless we all agree on how to measure it, it becomes really hard and it becomes really murky. But I would say that online usually has a lot more of those things that can make it addictive, in terms of kind of usually like the randomness of it. You can play with your friend groups. You can play with anybody from around the world. Kind of the investment. Usually online games, they don't really have the end compared to more single player games, or if you're just playing by yourself, because those games usually have some ending. But usually the ones that are played online, it just keeps going. Like, it doesn't stop. So I guess that's my thoughts on the matter right now. But once we get some like actual criteria that sticks, I think we'll come up with better answers for that.
My understanding is internet gaming disorder in the DSM currently is in the area for further study, right? Not in the main body of the book.
The section 3. Yep.
Right. Right.
Yeah. I forgot to mention that, but yes, that is completely true.
Any other questions? Question from Britt Holbrook. Where do you come down on the question of whether esports are sports? Well,
so I actually had a slide on that I kind of had to take out just for time's sake. But because a lot of people ask me, like, what about streamers and whatnot? Are they addicted? And I would say no, because that is their livelihood. They are spending time practicing or training to get better, and that's how they survive. That's how they pay for their stuff, right? So I would say, yeah, they're definitely athletes. They might not be like in the greatest physical shape as like somebody who's playing football or something like that, but the amount of time that they're spending training is definitely I think worthy of that title. And the amount of money for some of these pots, like for these tournaments, like, oh my gosh, like some of them are like hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars. For some of these tournaments, like League of Legends or StarCraft, things like that. So I would definitely agree on that they are athletes.
We have time for one more question, if there are any other questions. Okay. Well, Dustyn, this has been educational and entertaining, all of that. So thank you again so much for agreeing to be a speaker for our series. Really, really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody else did as well. Please join us, everybody, for our next lecture on Thursday, October 15th, also at 9 a.m. on virtually immersive reality for the study of racial bias in police use of force. And so I look forward to seeing you all there. Thanks again, Dustyn, and thanks everybody for coming out to watch us here and participate.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay. Bye now.